Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Ambassador's Lounge. The topic of our discussion today is of great significance, not only for us but for the world as a whole, and that is climate change. This climate change is climate change or global warming. Global warming is just one aspect of climate change. The purpose of this program is to create an awareness among the people of the gravity of the situation, the impact which the climate change or global warming is having and will have on our way of life. We need to understand that this is not an abstract phenomenon. Global warming is real, it is here, and it has already started impacting the planet. It is the most potent threat to our way of life. To discuss climate change, we have with us Ambassador Shafqat Kakakhel. Ambassador Kakakhel has served, he is from the Foreign Service of Pakistan, and he has served in various important capitals. He was last High Commissioner of Pakistan to Kenya with concurrent accreditation to Uganda and Ethiopia. But what makes it most relevant to have him with us on this issue is that he was also Deputy Executive Director of United Nations Environment Program, which is the focal body of the UN dealing with environmental issues and climate change. He was also member task force on climate change, an advisory group on climate change. Then he was elected member of UN framework on climate change. Lastly, he was elected co-chair of Climate Action Network for South Asia. Welcome to the program, sir.
My pleasure, Ambassador.
To share this discussion, I have with me Ambassador Riaz Bukhari. There is a World Economic Forum report 2021 which states the failure to mitigate and adapt to climate change is the most impactful risk facing communities worldwide, ahead of even weapons of mass destruction. Climate change transforms global ecosystems. It affects everything from the places we live to the water we drink to the air we breathe. May I have your comments on this thing, sir?
Yeah. Indeed, climate change has emerged. In a short period of 3 decades or so, it has emerged as the defining challenge facing humankind. How the international community deals with this problem will determine whether we have a chance to survive on this planet, let alone thrive. And it's not only human beings, it's plant, animal species, it's everything that is underground, on the ground, in the atmosphere. So the survival of all living organisms depends on how we deal with the problem of climate change, with the drivers of climate change, with the impacts of climate change, and the way climate change affects different countries of the world differently because of their differing capacities to cope with it.
Thank you, sir. A number of conferences have been held so far at the global level to deal with this issue, and everybody talks about the developed countries, blaming them of causing this problem at the global level. Do you think the global countries are on target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And particularly, sir, there are some reports which were released under the UN sponsorship. They point out that the world needs to reduce 45% global emission. However, on the contrary, Particularly, we see, the Western countries are still on the course to increase it by 14% in 2030. So how do you see this situation developing while a number of arrangements at the global level have been made to reduce it, but we don't see any reduction in the next 10 years?
Yeah. Well, the best way to answer your question is first to explain how the problem of climate change was created. The problem of climate change has essentially resulted from the massive use of fossil fuels. Coal initially, and later on oil, and more recently gas. These fossil fuels, the emissions from them, has changed the chemistry of global environment, of global climate. And as you know, these fossil fuels did not exist before the Industrial Revolution. We are basically talking about 1850 or so. The Industrial Revolution improved people's lives and everything, but the concentration of greenhouse gases in about 100 years or so brought about fundamental changes in the way the climate operates. And so somewhere during the 1950s, scientists, climatologists began to observe that something is happening to the climate. There were a number of scientific conferences, and eventually the United Nations Environment Program, where I had the honor of serving for almost a decade, and the World Meteorological Organization, WMO, which is based in Geneva, the headquarters. They've established an expert panel, which is called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to provide an assessment on the causes of climate change, the impacts of climate change, and the response to climate change. The first report came in 1990, and on the basis of that, the United Nations sponsored negotiations. In 1992. Pakistan was the chair of G77, and it had the honor of leading the group of the G77 in the negotiations. This conference in Rio in June 1992 produced the United Nations Convention on Climate Change. That remains to this day the most important statement of global consensus on the causes of climate change, the impacts, and the response. The convention established, and rich countries signed on it, that it was the emissions, the actions of the advanced economies that had led to the problem of climate change. The convention again stated the scientific consensus. This convention was the first spectacular example of science dictating policy. That while the impacts of climate change will be felt throughout the globe, the developing countries will be worse affected for the simple reason that they wouldn't. First, they depend on natural resources, which will be adversely affected, and they would not have the capacity. Because developing countries, I mean, even in 1990, you're talking about 132 countries of the planet who are considered developing countries and do not have the financial resources, the scientific capacity, and So the rich countries were also obligated by the convention to take the lead in reducing their emissions, and that's where your question becomes relevant. Have they fulfilled their commitment? No. Up till today, 2023, there has been no significant reduction in the emissions of the advanced economies of the world. The only difference that has happened is that whereas until 20 years ago, most of the emissions came from traditional rich economies, in the past 20 years, China, India, Russia, and a few other countries have become significant emitters of greenhouse gases. So we are in a situation during the COVID, the pandemic. There was a slight 7 to 8% reduction, but there was literally a rebound of emissions, and so we are where we were. But what has happened is the humankind has developed the tools, the capacity to deal with climate change, and that the most important key that we have been able to acquire is that energy. We have found alternative means of energy which are not as polluting as the traditional sources of energy, which is coal and oil and gas. The report, the target that you mentioned, reduction of greenhouse gases by 45% by 2030, has actually come from the panel I mentioned. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was requested by governments to produce a report on whether the target that was fixed in Paris in 2015 of limiting the warming compared to pre-industrial levels to between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius, whether that was achievable. And the IPCC said yes, provided you bring about a reduction in the emissions 45% by 2030, and by 2050, the planet, the entire world, should achieve net zero, which actually means that you will be emitting, but you should have compensatory, measures. And so, as I said, the present situation of emissions is disparate, but with countries like China, in this summer, which was as hot in China as it was elsewhere, the Chinese secured more than 30% of their electricity needs from renewable energy. So you have other figures also, but we need to do much more.
Sir, if you can, you were talking about Intergovernmental Panel. Now, the latest report of Intergovernmental Panel, which states that the temperatures will rise by 2.1 degrees Celsius by 2100, that is 2100, even if the countries fully implement their pledges. Now, my question is, do these countries need to have more ambitious targets? Have we reached that tipping point? Are the changes which are happening, they are reversible or not?
We are almost hitting the tipping point. Why the IPCC says that in spite of reductions you will have problem is because greenhouse gases, one of the characteristics of, or the major problem with greenhouse gases is that they stay in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. These are called the accumulated historic emissions. You know, if you have, like we in Pakistan, we burn biomass, animal residue for cooking and all in the villages.
Yeah.
But one good shower and the effect of that, that also produces emissions. But during the monsoon, it's all cleared. But greenhouse gases, oil, gas, and coal, are stubborn. They stay in the atmosphere. So, I don't know. It may not be able, we may not be able to completely to go to the pre-industrial revolution purity of climate, even by the best available
And they
means.
say the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it has doubled as compared to pre-industrial revolution.
Absolutely, absolutely. If you take the measurement of, ppm per million, then it has doubled, absolutely doubled. That's the measurement of carbon in the atmosphere.
Yeah. Sir, ultimately the governments have to play, the key role if we really want to have a positive effect of climate change at the global level. Do you think the willpower and the ingenuity at the government level is there to turn around the wheel? Or is there a global consensus to deal with this issue of climate change?
Yes, as I mentioned, the convention 1992, UN Convention on Climate Change, does represent the global consensus, and it was reiterated in 2015 in the Paris Agreement.
Yeah.
So the Paris Agreement basically reiterated the four or five major pillars of the global consensus.
Yeah, 5 pillars.
The first the pillar is that mitigation. The humankind, everybody has to try to reduce the impact, to reduce the drivers, the role of the drivers that cause, which is basically emissions of fossil fuel. The second pillar is that rich countries must support developing countries in coping with the consequences of climate change. And the rich countries have to also adopt. This is called the climate adaptation.
Yeah.
But there is the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Every country is responsible, but developed countries are more responsible because they have more capacity.
Yeah.
So they have to help developing countries through financial flows, through transfer of technology, through capacity building, and sharing of best practices with the developing countries. And for that, a whole lot of international mechanisms and institutions have developed. The other 2 points are that the science and technology can and must play a central role in the objective of mitigating climate change as well as adapting to the impacts of climate change. And the fourth pillar is capacity building. And that is the capacity of developing countries, because they did not create the problem of climate change. And they have never had a chance of developing their technology. Some of them did, but the majority of developing countries. How many Chinas do you have in the developing world? How many Indias do you have? So it is incumbent upon the developed countries to give support to developing countries. And for that you have a whole machinery. So the fifth pillar, which is actually a common pillar to all the four, is finance. Because nothing in the world happens without it's money that makes the mayor go. So finance has always been, it's the most complicated subject because you are talking the rich countries to part with their money. Nobody wants to part with their
So
money.
that's where it, you see, he said, is there a consensus now on this climate change? It's very strange that at the moment, first of all, the former US administration under Mr. Trump, they walked out of Paris Agreement. And then now we see NATO countries, US, everyone more interested in war in Ukraine. They are doling out billions of dollars there, whereas the climate change is a more urgent priority, which should be dealt like that. So, I find it very strange that are they really concerned about this situation?
Well, Trump walked out of the Paris Agreement because Republicans have historically represented what you can call the vested interests. The big industry, both civilian and military, and people who do not want to pay taxes. Historically, Republicans have always shied away from paying taxes, from the role of government, whereas Democrats have been more forthcoming. And you are indeed, you are right that the situation has changed dramatically. The Ukraine war has actually been a major setback to the international community's efforts to fight the multidimensional threat of climate change. Why? What is the importance of Russia and Ukraine to the West? It's energy supplies.
Yeah.
And if you go on a war path with Russia, which is a major source of natural gas and oil, and Ukraine is also, by the way, a major source of grain. So the Western countries got frightened that, in fact, in Germany, they started dusting up their old plants, the coal plants, which had been closed down. And they said, we will revive those because we may not have enough gas for the winter, for the coming winter. In Britain, they had phased out coal during Margaret Thatcher's time, but they started reviving that. So the Ukraine war has, among other things, African countries are worried about their food security. Pakistan should be worried about our food security because of Ukraine. We have been buying, we are substantial importers of food. Once upon a time, in 2008 to 2010, we were self-sufficient. In fact, we used to give Afghanistan between 1 and 2 million tons of wheat and some rice. But now we are net importers because the most important reason is a population explosion.
Sir, awareness about the issue is very important. Recently, I was visiting, USA for a month. What I have seen, in a certain area in the USA, like Washington, New York, Pittsburgh, and back, while traveling, I thought perhaps the people were really taking care of the climate change and about their environment. Their lakes were clean, their rivers were clean, industries were emitting, white smoke. There was no dark smoke at all, and people at their personal level were not polluting the environment. How do you see the role of awareness in controlling, the increasing climate change at the global level?
Awareness is fundamental to the problem of climate change. Unless you are aware of what is the problem, you will not do what the Europeans, the rich countries have done. Indeed, I mean, in the advanced countries of the world, the water is less polluted.
Yeah.
In Finland, you can literally drink
Yeah.
from the lakes. And so many other countries, in Canada, the same. But can you do that in Pakistan? No. In Pakistan, all the lakes. In Punjab, we have 50 lakhs, including Rawal Lake, all heavily polluted. The same is the lakes in Sindh, like the Kirtar, which used to be a beautiful lake. So awareness is the key, is a prerequisite for action. You make people aware. In Ireland, in so many countries I've been to, from primary school, even the alphabets are designed in such a way that the child becomes aware. So W is always water.
Yeah.
T is always tree. And we have to do the same. We have considerable progress in making our elders aware, I mean, educated people, but our educational system needs to be greened.
So, one final question.
I have one. After that.
Okay. He has one more. So, you talked about Africa, the food situation, the food problems in there. One more issue in Africa is the climate refugees.
Yeah.
Now, because of this climate change and because of this global warming, there's a mass displacement of people in Africa. For instance, in East Africa at the moment alone, there are 3 million refugees as a result of drought. Now, again in Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, Somalia, this is the 6th consecutive year of rain failure. Now, it's very ironical again that these countries which are most affected by this climate change, they are the least who can afford it. They need more help. That help is not forthcoming.
That is exactly the tragedy of climate change and the international community. We have the same problem in Pakistan. Of course, it depends in different countries, different things cause the climate refugees. In Pakistan, it's the rising level of sea. When the sea rises, the seawater inundates the coastal regions, destroying homes, human settlements, and contaminating sweet water. So you can't use the water for anything. Fishing is affected. Farming is affected because farming, you can't cultivate plants with salinated water. So there have been movements from Badin, Tatta, Sajawal to Karachi or Hyderabad. Pakistan also has a problem. And what you have to do is basically find alternative livelihoods for the people.
That is the problem in Africa. They don't have, 70% of Africa are pastoralists. They depend on agriculture and they don't have these means. If they move towards urban centers, then they get inundated and they don't have that capacity.
Yes, you had the same problem in Bangladesh, but Bangladesh, for instance, has been able to do very well in textile exports and all, and so they have the means now. And they have a very impressive system of early warning. They give these small radios to all the farmers, to everybody. It costs something like 100 takas. And that gives them warning of cyclones, of hurricanes, of floods. So the victims of floods are far less than when they were with us.
Sir, the COP27 was held in Sharm el Sheikh, and next is due to be held in Abu Dhabi this year, I believe. Do you see any positive outcome from the Abu Dhabi COP?
Well, first of all, I mean the Sharm el Sheikh conference, COP, I was there as a civil society representative. It also, and Pakistan was the chair of G77, and our ambassador Nabil, and they did a marvelous job. We got a major success in the form of an agreement on loss and damage mechanism, which had eluded us or the international community since 1990. Since 1990, developing countries were saying, look, climate change will cause loss which is irredeemable and damage which can be repaired. And we need a separate mechanism to deal with those issues. The small island states might disappear. So they will need alternative homes. And so Sharm el Sheikh was also a success. COP28, which is going to be hosted by Dubai, and the Dubai people are preparing for 80,000 delegates. Never before has the international community seen 80,000 persons. These are not only government. These are non-governmental organizations, business, and all kinds of people, stakeholders, go to the COP. You will be absolutely amazed. And Sultan Al-Jaber,
He was here, I believe.
who was head of EDNOC,
Yeah.
now he is designated the, in fact, when he came, they never mentioned that he's head of EDNOC. They mentioned that he's Science Technology Minister, and also the COP28. He's under tremendous pressure. He's under tremendous pressure from countries like Germany, like Britain, and they have somehow enlisted Kenya also, to facilitate an early phase down or phase out. There is also a precise difference between these two. And he gave they wrote a major a letter in the Financial Times. And Sultan Al-Jaber replied, and I'm very sympathetic to what he said. He said, look, phasing out the old methods of energy, we are addicted to, we are dependent on fossil fuel energy. We have agreed to move away from it and go for cleaner energy. But it has to be a transition. All transitions take years to become effective. So, unless and until we are able to put on the ground an alternative system of energy, don't deprive the world. It is unrealistic, it's unachievable. So, there's going to be a lot of tamasha. There will be, the NGOs will try to organize demonstrations, and they do all kinds of tricks, basically to emphasize the point. I'm very sympathetic because I've been dealing with environmental issues since 1994, when I was permanent representative of Pakistan to the United Nations Environment Program. But these countries sometimes, put pressure because he's from a developing country. China faces the same predicament. The Americans, you had the Treasury secretary, and now you have the special envoy John Kerry going to Beijing to ask them to give more support to climate change. What are they doing themselves? Just because they are now, China is now, since actually 2005, they overtook the United States as the biggest emitter. But there has to be a balance.
Thank you very much, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, you watched our program. This is the first part of the program on climate change. And the second part will deal with South Asia and in particular Pakistan. Ambassador Shafqat Kakakhel will be with us in the second program. Thank you for watching.